Okay, hello everybody, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast. Right now, we are still exploring the 1961 disappearance of Joan Risch, who disappeared from her home in Lincoln, Massachusetts on October 24th, 1961, approaching the 66th anniversary of that in about 2 weeks. To begin this one, I would like to give a big shout out to the YouTuber Sophie Unsolved, who runs a true crime channel and a mystery channel. And once again, her name is Sophie Unsolved, and she put out a very, very nice presentation on the disappearance of Joan Risch. So if anyone's interested, you can check that out. Now, when I began doing these uploads, this is about the seventh one I've done, and this will be the final one for a while. I was about only believing that this was a staged disappearance. Maybe only 10%, only about 10% feeling that Joan Risch had staged her own disappearance and planted fake evidence and disappeared on her own terms, as a calculated plan. Yet, that was my first feeling when I first began this case. We're talking about, just reading the headline of a Wikipedia on the disappearance of Joan Risch, like, what? What's this? And then I read about how some people think that because of her interest in true crime and mysteries that she staged the disappearance. As I began to explore the information, I really became about a 90% proponent that this was not a staged disappearance. This was an abortion or a miscarriage that, fell into some very tragic behavior and a very tragic situation, rather. And I had recently what's called a Renner shift, and that's when you go from being about 90% certain of something to only being about 40% certain of it. So I really could only say I would believe that this was an abortion or miscarriage about 40%. And now I'm about 60% in favor that this was an actual staged disappearance, a calculated plot by Joan Risch to disappear and to leave her life behind. Some of the reasons for that, I have stated a few in the other uploads, but just to go over some of them, I don't think the witness testimonies are very credible, and that is actually one thing that Sophie Unsolved really brought to my attention, is just that witnesses can be mistaken, that they can be wrong, that they can, maybe they aren't 100% sure that they are seeing what they are seeing. And we all sometimes have very, very few ways of backing up their stories, such as one witness, sees a woman walking down the road with blood on her legs, that's not the same as having 30 people witness that, or, for example, we don't have any video recordings of Joan after she disappeared. We have no audio recordings. We don't have any photographs of her that would have been possible in 1961, if someone just had a photograph of her, or, all of those things could have been possible: photo, video, and audio in 1961. None of that is there. So it's very difficult to support any sort of witness testimony as the pure, hard evidence. If that's going to be the thing that is going to be sort of pushing you over the fence in either direction, it really is just going to be one compelling witness. It would really take one very convincing witness. And in one of the previous uploads, I really stated that I'm starting to not believe the witness testimonies that much right now. The other thing that I really thought made this feel like a staged disappearance was the blood evidence. I have a whole upload on the blood evidence, and just to kind of recap, I don't think it fits any sort of consistent pattern related to anything other than a staged disappearance. For example, the blood is found in just so many locations throughout the house, but only in such small amounts, with the exception of the kitchen. Also, there's that awkward blood evidence on the car that is difficult to interpret, and that really struck to me that was planted However, at the time, though, I didn't really have, a very. I wasn't able to formulate other parts of the theory. That was just the one thing that stood out. I was like, I think the blood evidence supports a staged disappearance, but absolutely nothing else does. Such as the witness sightings. I mean, if she did fake her own disappearance, why is she being seen walking on the median of a highway in plain sight 2 hours later? I mean, someone would want to lay low, right, if they're trying not to be found. However, that witness testimony might not be 100%. Maybe that witness isn't sure what they saw, or if that event even happened at all. It's difficult to say going back to 1961. The other thing that I thought that was very sort of kind of eye-opening, and you might think that this is nothing. However, I would like to say it again anyway, is originally I believed that Joan was just in a very disoriented state, like that she either had the botched abortion or the miscarriage, and she was just in a very disoriented state, and she just wandered out of the house and then just kept on walking, and so disoriented that she left her baby, and then she left her purse and her identification. Yeah, if I were to say that, though, how did she have the sense to go to her closet and take her light overcoat? How did she have the sense to, think about that, but she didn't have the sense to take her purse? Something doesn't, seem right about that, because she didn't wear the light overcoat to the dentist's office. She wore her heavier overcoat, the trench coat one. So what is there to say about that? You might think that's nothing, but to me that is just like, that doesn't show someone who is disoriented. That shows someone who kind of has some sense and awareness still there. Now I would also say, though, and you feel free to disagree with me with this too, the single biggest clue in this mystery is the beer bottles. I think the beer bottles tell us so much. And I think there are two major possibilities. The first one I mentioned was that beer is used in a wide variety of home-concocted abortions, and that it was very possible that Joan was either unintentionally just drinking beer, like, not unintentionally drinking beer. She was drinking beer, and that unintentionally caused a miscarriage, and then she got very disoriented and pulls the phone out of the wall, throws it in the wastebasket, and that's what triggered this. Or that she was actually intentionally trying to use beer in a home-concocted abortion, such as beer with salt, beer with spices, boiled beer, you name it, they're all out there. Beer with aspirin, actually. That was another one that I didn't get to mention in the earlier podcast. Someone suggested online, beer mixed with aspirin can cause an abortion. And, I mean, the other way you could interpret that is, her husband did not know that where the beer bottles came from. He could not explain how these beer bottles got into his house. He didn't have beer in the house the night before. He could explain where the liquor bottle came from, but he couldn't explain where the beer bottles came from. This could also be somebody getting a little drunk, so maybe they don't feel it very much when they want to make an incision in their stomach and produce the blood evidence. In other words, Joan wanted to make a superficial wound that would produce some blood evidence, but not too much, And the doctors and the medical examiners and the medical experts that looked at this, the first thing that they said was, this appears to be the blood from a superficial wound. They could not rule out hemorrhaging. They could not rule out a miscarriage, but their first instinct was that this was a superficial wound, non-fatal, not a stabbing. So it's possible that somebody could have just, put back a few beers, if you will, so they wouldn't feel the pain. And that is another reason why I've sort of had such a big change of heart with the theory, because That was one thing that never I could never wrap my mind around. It's not going to be easy for a person to make a major wound into their stomach. I mean, probably the average person cannot even do that. A wound that would produce between 1 cup and 1 pint of blood, that's going to be very, very painful. Unless they've had 5 or 6 beers, 5'7" woman, and drinking 6 beers. Maybe she's not feeling that much, and with a very sharp knife, maybe it is possible. And look at the theory from this way. We have a very, very similar plot in the book Into Thin Air that shows somebody faking their own disappearance, leaving behind blood and towels. Joan disappears, leaving behind blood, rags, and a pair of her baby's clothes that were even used to clean up the blood. And another thing that someone was pointing out was the phone that is found in the trash does not appear to be thrown in there. It appears to be placed there very gently. And that again, that's just, an inference. It's just like almost even an assumption. But I mean, like, if someone were throwing a phone into a wastebasket, it most likely is not going to be standing upright. Also, the phone receiver is not most likely going to be hanging over the edge as it was. You can see those photos online. So anyway, someone puts back a few beers, they make the wound, they plant blood evidence, then they are able to take their light overcoat from the house and, again, plant some more blood evidence by the car, try to make it look like they cleaned up, and that also could be a very big reason why there are no footprints, why there were no bloody footprints found. It sounds more like, Joan makes a superficial wound into her stomach that is bleeding out, but, not to the point where it's going to be bleeding all over the floor and, like, gushing and flowing the way a stab wound would. So, she probably has something pressed against her stomach, like trying not to make everything come out at once, and then she is able to control the bleeding, more or less. In short, I'm trying to say that there were no bloody footprints, very possibly because Joan was able to control the scene, because Joan was in more of a stronger state of mind, monitoring the scene and looking at all the evidence. When I say looking at the evidence, looking at all the blood, rather, which eventually would become evidence. So, from there, after Joan has staged the scene, she takes her light overcoat and then just walks out with probably $10 or the equivalent of $80 in her pocket and disappears. Where does she go? We may never know. It's most likely she knew somebody if she left with such little money, and it's most likely she knew somebody. It's very possible she was having an affair, or maybe she just went off and tried to pursue becoming a writer or something, and just wanted to live a different life. And I hope that's not the case. I would hope a mother wouldn't abandon 2 children for that. But I think that the staged disappearance theory is something that maybe is starting to fit into place in the it's something where all the pieces are coming together and a solid picture is starting to form. Well, anyway, what do you think? I would love to hear more comments, and I would love to expand the discussion. And this is a tragedy, 2 kids had to grow up without their mother, and I would hope we could at least get some answers. Well, everybody have a good day, and I'll talk to you soon.